Here we are at 5 Points, which is no longer 5 Points anymore. There was a pond where the actual 5 Points ended up being, and they built tanning factories on the shores of this beautiful pond and polluted it to the point where the water was toxic and could no longer be used. So they covered it over with landfill. Right here, this was all the pond. We are now walking on water, if you will. The city fathers decided, let's just shove all these immigrants that are coming in, these Irish, Germans, Italians, Chinese, in this one area. And so over the course of a relatively short amount of time, it went from a beautiful pond to a ghetto. They're now rebuilding the pond, which I think is quite extraordinary. It'd be nice to have the pond back. It was right here. Now it's going to be Collect Pond, the sequel. This is where Corcoran lives. His house was in an area where Mulberry Street bent. That's why it was called Mulberry Bend. We just thought it was interesting because streets like this are historically the same street that Corcoran would have lived on in 1864. It was the worst spot you could live in. Of course, that's why we put Corcoran there. Cow Bay would have been over here. Cow Bay is featured on the show. It's where a body is found. A lot of bodies were dumped there because it was a convenient place to dump bodies. If you wanted a good time and you wanted to take your life in your hands, you would go down to 5 Points. What's remarkable is to go to that neighborhood now because it's where all the courthouses are. It's weird how lawless it was back then, and now it is the paragon of law. It was a slow process, the renovation of 5 Points. It was still slums through the turn of the 20th century. Teddy Roosevelt, when he was running New York City, he was one of the instigators to try to change the neighborhood for the better. Now, if you believe that having courthouses is better than having people live in a neighborhood, then they succeeded. This is when I do jury duty. This is where I have to go. I spent a lot of time in that park trying to figure out how to get out of jury duty. Over there was where the African Americans primarily lived during the period. And over here was all Irish. And now, as you can see, it's quite a different population. What's great about what we're experiencing right now is a lot of sound, and even though it's a very different sound than you would have experienced in 5 Points in 1864, you can understand the kind of life that existed, and which we're trying to recreate on the show, is that there's a lot of sound going along with the actual dialogue in the pictures. We put those street singers in simply because they would have been there, in the same way we have dogs and horses and all that stuff. We just wanted there to be a lot of texture that way. If you look at a building like this one over here, this was probably built in the 1860s. You can tell by the height. Probably each window was a separate room, and there were families living in each room. It wasn't like anybody had a floor. It was all divided up. The kitchen was in the same room as the bed was. There were a lot of fires. There were, of course, no fire escapes back then in the 1860s, so if there was a fire in that building, you had to jump. See, this would have been built probably in the 1860s. Back then, you literally were living on top of each other, and we see this in the show a lot, where people are literally living on top of each other in very small, cramped spaces. And it was very dangerous. Buildings would collapse. This situation hasn't changed much. Landlords cram as many people in a space as they possibly can. The difference is now we have a certain amount of housing codes where they have to ensure the safety of people. You know, it's important to remember that people lived in neighborhoods as this neighborhood is now. You lived with the people of your own kind of nationality. When you came over as an immigrant, you wanted to be protected. You wanted to know that people would speak your language. When I was a kid, this was very Italian, but it's not very Italian anymore. It's only Italian on San Gennaro Festival. And suddenly everyone's Italian again. Here's the Transfiguration Church, which figures in the show. Unfortunately, we don't use this exterior because you can see it looks a little non-period. Originally on this spot stood the African Zion Church, which also features in the show. I just love the way it's constructed. It's a beautiful building. For most immigrant families and most immigrant communities, religion became an essential thing that would bring them together. This was not just a church, it was a place of meeting and community action. Unfortunately, now a lot of parishes are closing because they don't have as many people in the neighborhood to support the church, but they're always adapting to the community they have to serve. But I have a feeling Transfiguration will be here for a while. I think it's important that we have a perspective of how difficult it was for these people on a day-to-day basis. They didn't wash their clothes every day. They didn't even change their clothes every day. You had to go outside to a pump and fill a bucket up in order to wash your face. Hot water had to be boiled if you were going to take a bath. It wasn't just turn on a faucet and get into a nice hot bath. You had to actually work to get that bath.
I can hardly breathe with that putrid smell. Close the window.
We can't even imagine how much it smelled.
That horse has been laying dead there 3 days.
I'll get some boys to drag it away.
On the show, we're trying to replicate this. We're trying to get to the point where you actually smell through the TV set. There was a lot of sickness, plagues, diphtheria would go through the community, and it wasn't like there were tons of doctors around, or even that medicine was that advanced. A lot of doctors were still using the ancient Roman methods of curing people. Bleeding and leeches and that kind of fun stuff.
Might I interest you in a bottle of Dr. Beville's Miracle Cure-All? This here is the genuine article. An elixir, scientifically proven to cure more than 31 known diseases.
They had advanced to having ether, laughing gas. They could make you at least feel less in pain.
You've suffered enough pain. Matter of fact, so have I.
The dentist actually says 20 years ago I had to hit people with a hammer in order to knock them out.
Doesn't look rotten to me.
They pulled the wrong tooth.
Oh my God!
I mean, to me, like the fact they didn't have aspirin, I would not have lived 60 years without aspirin. I would have died at about 22, just from the hangovers alone. Morphine was invented during this period solely to help Civil War soldiers deal with the pain of being wounded or having legs amputated or whatever happened to them. At the time, morphine was considered like we would think the cure for cancer would be today. That's how stunning it was as a discovery. What happened was they had no idea how to control it. They had no idea of the negative effect of it. The doctors just gave it to these soldiers and gave it to these soldiers and created a generation of addicts who all came back to the cities they lived in, New York included, and were addicted. They weren't even aware that it was an addiction. They didn't have the concept of it as an addiction. This wouldn't have been an alley. This would have been a proper street. These streets weren't built for cars, they were built for horses and wagons. It was two-way traffic, it was chaos, and if you needed to pull over to let somebody else go by, you just took your wagon over to the side and let the other guy come in your direction. This would have been actually built in the 1820s. On the set, what we have are, you'll notice, on the walls, there's constant advertisements, political posters, and also laundry hanging out. So even though it's in a different language, it's not all that different from what it would have been back then. But you always wonder with these, what happened down there 100 years ago? In the very first 5 minutes of the show, a grocer comes out and sort of dumps the spoiled vegetables. It's the morning, and so he's getting ready for the new day, and he just dumps a bunch of things. And this group of homeless people just jump all over it to eat, and even a dog comes over and starts eating it. Because that's the kind of thing, that's the kind of way it was back then.
What's your name, darling?
Annie?
Are you on your own?
There was an actual child, a minister, an Episcopal minister, wrote a book about her, became a very, very big seller because it was all about how she was this poor little orphan girl who was rescued by the well-intended, wealthy people. Poor Anastasia having to deal with that hoop skirt. It's pretty elaborate amount of clothes. What I don't understand is how they even had sex back then. Because in order to get a woman naked, it took about 7 hours to get all that stuff off her. And by that point, you're like, hey, let's just have a cigarette and pretend we had the sex. Boss Tweed was on the rise at this point.
Take your free drink, courtesy of Mr. Tweed.
He figured out that the way to win elections was to create ward bosses. They would get paid to get votes.
Keep moving. We got an election to win here.
And we actually deal with this on the show on the election day when Lincoln is up for re-election. One of our guys is literally helping disguise fellow Irishmen to go back in and vote several times. They didn't think of it as corrupt because it was standard procedure. It wasn't like they had a moral dilemma about it. It was what everybody did.
That's not gonna do.
It's only us with our grand sense of morality that we can make a judgment about them. But we try to have fun with it too. We're not preaching on this show. We're basically telling a story, and it is part of the life they lived. It's not done too seriously. The heart of what we were trying to do with creating 5 Points was to truly give a sense of what it was like to live there as opposed to replicating the exact look of the place. There's a lot of it that looks like the real 5 Points looked. But I think what we were really going for in terms of this time and this place was how cramped and basic and raw the life that these men and women had to live. It was pretty remarkable to see it all come together, and how detailed it is. It grounds it in a very real place.